What you're about to hear is a story that defies everything you think you know about justice, love, and the thin line between right and wrong in the lawless territories of the Wild West. This is the true account of Sheriff Jacob Morgan, a man who built his reputation on an iron will and an unwavering commitment to the law, and how one fateful encounter with a wanted killer would unravel everything he believed in, leading to a finale so shocking that it changed the fate of an entire town. Before we dive into this tale of obsession, betrayal, and impossible choices, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the stories on this channel get darker and more twisted with every upload, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 1873, and the town of Redemption Creek sat like a dusty wound in the heart of Arizona Territory, a place where men came to forget their past and where the future promised nothing but hardship and the occasional strike of silver that kept hope alive in the hearts of desperate prospectors. Sheriff Jacob Morgan had arrived in Redemption Creek 5 years prior, a young man of 25 with cold gray eyes and a reputation that preceded him from his time as a deputy in Kansas, where he tracked down the notorious Holloway gang and brought them to justice, all 6 of them, in a shootout that left him with a bullet scar across his ribs and a name that commanded respect. Jacob wasn't the tallest man, standing at 5'10", but he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made even the hardest men think twice before causing trouble, his lean frame deceptive in its strength, his face angular and weathered beyond his years, with a jawline that seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mesas that surrounded the town. He'd been appointed sheriff after the previous lawman had been gunned down by a gang of cattle rustlers, and in those 5 years, Jacob had cleaned up Redemption Creek with a methodical efficiency that bordered on ruthless, reducing the murder rate to nearly nothing and ensuring that the town's 3 saloons, 2 general stores, and single church could operate without the constant threat of violence that plagued so many frontier settlements. Jacob lived alone in a small room behind the sheriff's office, a sparse existence of a cot, a wooden chair, a desk covered in wanted posters, and a shelf holding a dozen law books that he'd read cover to cover multiple times during the long, quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come. He had no wife, no sweetheart, no family to speak of since his parents had died of cholera when he was 16, leaving him to make his own way in a world that didn't care much for orphans or sentiment. The townsfolk respected him, feared him a little, but nobody could say they truly knew Jacob Morgan because he kept his thoughts locked up tighter than the cells in his jail, speaking only when necessary and never revealing the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. His routine was unchanging. Wake before dawn, walk the perimeter of town checking for signs of trouble, have breakfast at Martha's boarding house where the coffee was strong and the biscuits reminded him faintly of his mother's cooking, spend the morning doing paperwork or settling minor disputes, patrol again in the afternoon, have dinner at the saloon where he'd nurse a single whiskey while keeping an eye on the card games and the drifters passing through, and then return to his office to review wanted posters and territorial dispatches before trying to sleep for a few hours before the cycle began again. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. When the stage from Tucson rolled into town 3 hours late, the driver whipping the horses harder than usual, his face pale beneath layers of trail dust, and before the coach had even fully stopped, he was shouting for the sheriff, his voice cracking with urgency. Jacob emerged from his office, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt peacemaker on his hip, his eyes scanning the scene for immediate threats, noting the way the stage sat low on its springs and the bullet hole punched clean through the rear panel. The driver, a grizzled veteran named Pete Collins who'd been running this route for 15 years, practically fell from his seat, his legs shaky as he stumbled toward Jacob, grabbing the sheriff's arm with surprising strength. "Sheriff Morgan, you ain't gonna believe what happened," Pete gasped, his breath coming in short bursts. "We got hit about 20 miles south, near Devil's Canyon. 4 riders came out of nowhere, and I thought we were all dead for sure. Thought they'd kill every last one of us and take everything. But then—" He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes darting back to the coach. "But then what, Pete?" Jacob asked, his voice calm, steady, the voice that had talked down more than one situation that could have turned bloody. "But then she saved us," Pete continued. "One of the passengers, a woman traveling alone, she had a rifle hidden in her luggage, and when those bandits started shooting, she shot back, dropped two of them clean off their horses before the others ran. Saved all our lives, Sheriff, including mine, and I've been doing this job long enough to know a professional when I see one. That woman can shoot better than any man I ever met." Jacob's interest sharpened like a blade being drawn across a whetstone, his mind already cataloging details, already asking questions. "This woman," he said, "she's still in the coach?" Pete nodded, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "Yes, sir. She's in there with the other passengers. Said she needed to speak with the law as soon as we arrived, said it was important. And Sheriff, there's something about her, something I can't quite put my finger on, but she ain't no ordinary traveler." Jacob approached the coach, his boots crunching on the packed dirt of the main street, aware of the small crowd beginning to gather, curious townspeople drawn by the commotion. And as he reached for the door handle, he found himself wondering what kind of woman traveled alone in this territory, what kind of woman could shoot like a professional gunfighter, and what kind of business she might have with him. He opened the door and looked inside, and in that moment, in that single heartbeat of recognition, the trajectory of Jacob Morgan's life changed forever in ways he couldn't possibly understand, not yet. Not until much later, when he'd look back on this moment and realize that fate had set a trap for him, disguised as salvation. The woman sitting in the coach was perhaps 28 years old, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun that had come partially loose during the attack, revealing strands that caught the morning light like copper wire. Her face was striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with high cheekbones, a strong nose, and eyes of such deep green that they seemed to hold secrets older than the territory itself. Eyes that met Jacob's with an unsettling directness that most women of the era would have considered improper, but which she wore like armor. She was dressed in traveling clothes that were well made but dusty from the journey. A dark blue dress with practical buttons and sensible boots that had seen considerable wear, and across her lap lay a Winchester rifle that she handled with the casual familiarity of someone who'd grown up with such tools. "Sheriff Morgan, I presume," she said, her voice clear and educated, carrying the slight accent of someone from back east, perhaps Philadelphia or Boston, though with rough edges that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harder country. "You're carrying a rifle stained with fresh blood," Jacob observed, his lawman's eye noting the dark smears on the stock. "And Pete tells me you killed 2 men this morning. That's a serious matter, even in self-defense. I'll need your statement, and I'll need to know who you are and what brings you to Redemption Creek." The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that suggested she'd expected this reaction, maybe even prepared for it. "My name is Catherine DeVille," she said. "And yes, I killed 2 men this morning because they were going to kill everyone in this coach, including 3 children and an elderly woman. I don't regret it, and I'd do it again. And as for what brings me to your town, Sheriff, I'm here because I'm turning myself in." Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest, his hand moving fractionally closer to his gun without conscious thought. "Turning yourself in for what?" he asked, though some part of him, some instinct honed by years of hunting criminals, already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Catherine reached slowly into her satchel, moving carefully so as not to alarm him, and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the creases, and handed it to Jacob without a word. He unfolded it, and there, staring back at him from a wanted poster dated 3 years earlier, was a younger version of the woman sitting before him. Her hair shorter then, her face harder, and the name printed below the sketch made his blood run cold because he recognized it, had seen it on territorial dispatches, had read the reports of her crimes with the detached interest of a lawman dealing with problems far from his jurisdiction. Catherine Ann DeVille, wanted for robbery, murder, horse theft, and association with the notorious Red Canyon Gang.
Reward of $2,000, dead or alive, last seen in New Mexico territory. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. Jacob looked from the poster to the woman, then back again, his mind racing through possibilities, through protocols, through the simple mechanics of what he should do next, which was to place her under arrest, lock her in his jail, send a telegram to the territorial marshal, and collect the reward that would solve Redemption Creek's budget problems for the next year. "You're wanted for murder," he said flatly. "Multiple murders, according to this poster. And you just walked into my town and announced yourself. Why?" Catherine met his gaze without flinching, and in her eyes Jacob saw something he hadn't expected, something that looked almost like relief, mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. "Because I'm tired, Sheriff Morgan," she said simply. "Tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being the person that poster describes. I did terrible things, I won't deny that. I rode with men who did even worse. And I can't take back what I've done. But I can stop running. I can face what's coming. And maybe, just maybe, I can do something right before the end. Which is why I saved those people today. Why I've been trying to make different choices for the past year. Why I'm here talking to you, instead of riding on to California or Mexico, where I might actually have a chance at disappearing."
The jail cell in Redemption Creek was small but clean, 6 by 8 feet with a cot, a bucket, and a barred window that let in light but was too high and too narrow for escape. And as Jacob locked Catherine inside, their eyes met through the bars, and he saw no fear there, no anger, just a calm acceptance that was somehow more unsettling than any amount of pleading or defiance would have been. "I'll bring you some food and water," he said, his voice rougher than intended, "and I'll need to take your full statement about what happened on the stage. And Miss DeVille, I need to know if anyone's likely to come looking for you, if there's anyone from your old life who might try to break you out or cause trouble for this town." Catherine shook her head, moving to sit on the cot, her hands still cuffed in front of her, though Jacob knew he should remove them now that she was secured, should follow protocol, should treat her exactly like any other prisoner. "The Red Canyon gang is dead or scattered," she said. "The leader, a man named Samuel Cross, was killed by Texas Rangers about a year ago. Most of the others are either in prison or dead too. I'm the last one left, Sheriff, and nobody's coming for me, because there's nobody left who cares. I'm alone, have been for a long time now, which is probably what I deserve." Jacob left her there and returned to his office, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. And he sat at his desk, staring at the wanted poster, at Catherine's face rendered in crude pen and ink, and he read the descriptions of her alleged crimes with a growing sense of dissonance, because they didn't match the woman who'd saved a stage full of innocent people, who'd turned herself in, who'd spoken of exhaustion and wanting to do something right. The charges were serious: 3 counts of murder during robberies in New Mexico, 1 count of killing a deputy sheriff who'd tried to arrest her in a town called Las Vallecomos, multiple counts of theft and armed robbery, and association with a gang responsible for at least 15 deaths over a 2-year period. If even half of it was true, Catherine DeVille was a dangerous criminal who deserved everything the law would throw at her. But if even half of it was exaggerated or taken out of context, she was a woman who'd made terrible choices and was now trying to face the consequences. And Jacob realized with uncomfortable clarity that he desperately wanted to know which version was true, wanted to understand how a woman with an educated voice and haunted eyes had ended up riding with killers and thieves across the southwestern territories. He spent the rest of the morning sending telegrams. One to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson informing them of Catherine's capture and requesting instructions. Another to the sheriff in Las Valles asking for detailed information about the deputy's death. And a third to the rangers in Texas inquiring about Samuel Cross and the Red Canyon gang. And then he sat back and waited for responses that might take days to arrive, given the unreliable nature of telegraph lines in the territory. While he waited, he interviewed the stage passengers, taking detailed statements about the attack and Catherine's intervention. And every single one of them,
From the elderly Mrs. Henderson, who clutched her Bible and wept as she recounted how close they'd come to death, to the young father traveling with his 3 children who kept saying, "That woman saved my babies, Sheriff. Whatever she's done before, she saved my babies today," painted Catherine as a hero, as someone who'd acted with courage and precision when most people would have frozen in terror. Pete Collins was particularly effusive, describing how Catherine had stayed calm under fire, how she'd aimed with the kind of skill that came from years of practice, how she checked on the other passengers after the bandits fled to make sure everyone was unharmed, and how she'd helped him repair a damaged wheel before they continued to town. "I don't know what she's wanted for, Sheriff," Pete said. "And I ain't saying the law don't have its reasons, but that woman earned my respect today, earned it with blood and courage, and I'll testify to that in any court if it comes to it." As the afternoon wore on, Jacob found himself walking back to the cells more often than necessary, ostensibly to check on his prisoner, but really because he couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop wondering about the contradictions she represented. And each time he looked through the bars, he found Catherine sitting calmly, sometimes reading a Bible that Mrs. Henderson had insisted be given to her, sometimes just staring out the high window at the strip of blue sky visible beyond. And once, when he brought her dinner, she thanked him with such genuine warmth that it sent an unexpected jolt through his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but which felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with her criminal past. "Sheriff Morgan," she said, as he was leaving after that dinner visit, her voice stopping him at the door, "I want you to know I understand what you have to do. I understand the law, and I'm not going to fight it. But I'd like to tell you my story, not to excuse what I've done, but so that at least one person knows the truth before the end. Would you be willing to listen?" Jacob knew he shouldn't, knew that getting involved with a prisoner's personal history was a violation of the professional distance he'd always maintained, but he found himself nodding, found himself saying, "Tomorrow evening, after my rounds, I'll listen." And the smile she gave him, small and sad and grateful, stayed with him through the night as he lay in his cot staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about green eyes and copper hair and the way she looked at him like he was something more than just the law incarnate. The next evening, true to his word, Jacob pulled a chair up to Catherine's cell after the town had settled into its nightly routine, the saloon piano playing faintly in the distance, the desert air cooling rapidly as it always did after sunset, and he sat there in the lamplight waiting for her to begin, knowing that whatever she told him would change things, would complicate the simple mechanics of justice that had guided his entire adult life. Catherine sat on her cot, her hands folded in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of confession. And she told him a story that Jacob would never forget, a story that would haunt him in the weeks and months to come, a story that made the lines between right and wrong blur in ways he'd never expected. She'd been born Catherine Ann Westbrook in Boston, the daughter of a shipping merchant who'd lost everything in a bad investment when she was 15. And rather than face debtor's prison, her father had moved the family west seeking opportunities in the gold fields of California. But they'd never made it that far because her father had been killed in a dispute over a mining claim in New Mexico, murdered by a man who'd never faced justice because the local law was corrupt and controlled by the mining interests. And her mother had died 6 months later of grief and pneumonia, leaving Catherine alone at 16 with no money, no family, and no prospects in a territory that chewed up and spit out people like her with casual indifference. She'd survived by working in saloons, serving drinks, dodging the hands of drunk miners, saving every penny she could, and she'd been doing that for almost 2 years when she met Samuel Cross, a charming outlaw with silver tongue and dark eyes who promised her a better life, who told her she was too smart and too capable to waste her life serving whiskey to men who looked through her like she was nothing. And she'd believed him because she was 18 and desperate, and because he made her feel like she mattered for the first time since her father had died. Samuel Cross had been the leader of the Red Canyon Gang, a group of outlaws who robbed stages, banks, and payroll shipments across New Mexico and Arizona. And Catherine had joined them, learning to shoot, learning to ride, learning to survive in a world where weakness got you killed and the law was just another gang with badges. And at first, she'd told herself it was temporary, that she'd save money and leave. But one robbery led to another, and before she knew it, she was wanted, had blood on her hands, had become the kind of person she'd once feared. "The first time I killed someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was during a robbery in Socorro. I was 20 years old, and a bank teller tried to be a hero, reached for a gun hidden beneath the counter, and I shot him. Didn't even think about it, just pulled the trigger. And he fell, and there was so much blood, Sheriff, so much blood, and I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to take it back. But Samuel told me I'd done well, told me I was a natural, and I hated myself, hated what I'd become. But I didn't leave, didn't turn myself in, just kept riding, kept robbing, kept surviving.
Jacob listened without interruption, his face carefully neutral. But inside, something was shifting, some fundamental understanding about justice and choice and circumstance was being challenged by Catherine's words, by the raw honesty in her voice, by the way she took responsibility for her actions while also revealing the context that had shaped them. And he found himself thinking about his own past, about the choices he'd made, about how different his life might have been if his parents hadn't died, if he'd had to survive alone as a teenager in hostile country. Catherine continued her story, describing the 2 years she'd ridden with the Red Canyon Gang, the robberies that had mostly gone smoothly, the ones that had turned violent, the deputy she'd killed in Las Valles who'd drawn on Samuel during an arrest attempt and caught her bullet instead, how she'd carried the guilt of that death like a stone in her chest, how she'd started questioning everything after watching Samuel murder a stagecoach driver in cold blood even after the man had surrendered, how she'd finally found the courage to leave the gang a year ago, slipping away in the night after a robbery had gone wrong, taking nothing but a horse and her rifle and the clothes on her back, and how she'd been running ever since, working odd jobs under false names, always moving, always looking over her shoulder, until she'd finally decided that running was its own kind of prison, and that facing justice was the only way she'd ever be free. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Catherine said, looking directly at Jacob through the bars. "And I don't expect mercy from the courts. I know I'm likely to hang, and maybe that's what I deserve for the things I've done, but Sheriff, I need you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I've spent the last year trying to be better, trying to help people when I can. And when those bandits attacked the stage yesterday, I didn't even think. I just acted. Because I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people die. Not again. Not ever again. And if hanging is the price I pay for my crimes, then at least I'll die knowing that my last act was saving lives instead of taking them." Jacob sat there in silence for a long moment after she finished, the lamplight casting shadows across the cell, and he realized that his carefully constructed worldview, the black and white clarity of law and lawlessness that had sustained him for years, was crumbling around him like a riverbank in flood season. This woman was a killer, wanted by territorial law, responsible for deaths that included a lawman, but she was also a survivor, a person shaped by circumstances beyond her control, someone who'd found the strength to change, to choose differently, to turn herself in rather than keep running. And Jacob didn't know what to do with that complexity, didn't know how to reconcile the requirements of his badge with the growing conviction that Catherine DeVille deserved something more than the hangman's noose. The days that followed were among the strangest of Jacob's life, as he continued his duties as sheriff while wrestling with thoughts and feelings he'd never experienced before. And each evening, he found himself returning to Catherine's cell, bringing her meals, engaging in conversations that ranged from philosophy to literature to their shared experiences of loss and loneliness. And he discovered that she was intelligent, well-read despite her limited formal education, funny in a dry way that caught him off guard, and possessed of insights into human nature that came from surviving in its darkest corners. They talked about her childhood in Boston, about Jacob's upbringing on a Kansas farm before his parents died, about the books they'd read, about whether justice was a real thing or just a convenient fiction that societies told themselves. And Jacob found himself looking forward to these evening conversations with an anticipation that bordered on dangerous, found himself thinking about Catherine during his patrols, found himself defending her to his deputy, a young man named Tom Carter who'd made the mistake of calling her a murderous whore and had received a cold stare from Jacob that made him apologize and never speak that way again. The telegrams started arriving after 4 days, and the news they brought was mixed. The territorial marshal confirmed Catherine's identity and stated that she should be held for transport to Tucson for trial. The sheriff from Los Valles provided a detailed account of the deputy's death that largely matched Catherine's version and noted that there had been questions about whether the deputy had followed proper procedure in attempting the arrest.
and the Rangers confirmed that Samuel Cross was dead and that most of the Red Canyon gang had been eliminated, with Catherine being the last known survivor of the group. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities, through angles, through the cold calculus of a gunfight he couldn't avoid, and he realized with crystalline clarity that these men weren't here to rescue Catherine, weren't here as friends, because the Morrison brothers were bounty hunters with reputations for violence, men who'd killed for less than the $2,000 reward on Catherine's head, and they were here to collect, here to take her from Jacob's custody by force if necessary. And in that moment, standing in his office with his hand on his gun, Jacob Morgan made a decision that changed everything. A decision that betrayed everything he'd sworn to uphold, but which felt more right than anything he'd done in years. "Tom," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to go to the general store and tell Mr. Peterson to lock his doors and keep everyone inside. Then go to the church and do the same. Spread the word quietly that there's trouble coming and people need to stay off the streets. Can you do that?" Tom nodded, confused but trusting, and hurried out, leaving Jacob alone with the weight of what he was about to do. He walked back to the cells, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and Catherine looked up from the book she'd been reading, her expression changing from curiosity to concern as she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, standing, moving to the bars, and Jacob unlocked the cell door, his hands steady despite the hammering of his heart. "The Morrison brothers are here," he said. "They're bounty hunters, and they're here for you. And Catherine, I need you to listen very carefully because we don't have much time. I'm going to give you a choice. You can stay here and let me hand you over to them, and they'll take you to Tucson where you'll face trial and likely hang. Or you can trust me, can take the horse I'm going to give you and ride north toward Flagstaff. There's a settlement there called Pine Valley, run by Mormons who don't care much for territorial law and who'll give you sanctuary if you tell them I sent you. And you can start over, can have the life you've been trying to build, can be the person you've become instead of the person you were." Catherine stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock, with disbelief, with something that might have been hope. "You're letting me go?" she whispered. "Sheriff, you'd be destroying your career, your reputation, everything you've worked for. You'd be breaking the law. You'd be making yourself a criminal. Why would you do that?" Jacob stepped closer to the bars, close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of soap from the basin he'd provided for washing. And he spoke words he'd never expected to say, words that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Because in the past 8 days, I've come to know you, Catherine DeVille, and I've seen who you really are beneath the crimes and the wanted posters. I've seen your courage and your intelligence and your desperate desire to be better than your past. And I can't, in good conscience, hand you over to men who'll treat you like an animal. Can't stand by and watch the territorial system hang a woman who saved innocent lives and who's trying so hard to redeem herself. And because—" He paused, struggling with words, with feelings he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. "And because I think I'm falling in love with you, and I know that's insane, know it's unprofessional and probably stupid and definitely dangerous, but it's true. And I'd rather lose my badge than lose you to a rope. So please, take this chance, ride north, and live the life you deserve." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of spurs on wood as the Morrison brothers approached the sheriff's office. And Catherine reached through the bars, her hand finding Jacob's, her fingers intertwining with his. And in her eyes, Jacob saw tears forming, saw emotions he couldn't quite read, saw the reflection of his own impossible feelings. "If I run," she said softly, "they'll know you helped me. They'll hunt you too, Jacob. You'll lose everything. Your badge, your town, your life. I can't let you sacrifice that for me." Jacob squeezed her hand, his decision made, his path chosen, and he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The peace of a man who'd spent years living in black and white, finally accepting the infinite shades of gray that constituted real human existence.
My life was already lost, he said. I just didn't know it until you showed me what it could be, what it should be. And Catherine, I'm not asking you to stay. I'm not asking you to feel what I feel. I'm just asking you to live, to take this chance, to ride north and be free. And maybe someday, if the world's a little kinder than it has been, maybe our paths will cross again. But if they don't, at least I'll know I did the right thing. Finally, after all these years of hiding behind the law. The door to the office burst open, and 3 of the Morrison brothers stood there, the 4th presumably watching their horses. They were rough men in their 30s with sun-darkened skin, trail-worn clothes, and eyes that held the flat, empty quality of those who'd killed often enough that it no longer registered as significant. And the oldest, a man named Clay Morrison with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, smiled when he saw Jacob. But it was a smile devoid of warmth or humanity. "Sheriff Morgan," Clay said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "We heard you got Catherine DeVille locked up here. We're licensed bounty hunters, and we're here to collect her and the reward. So if you'll just hand over the prisoner, we'll be on our way and there won't be no trouble." Jacob stood in front of the cell, blocking their view of Catherine, his hand resting on his gun, and he met Clay's gaze with the cold certainty of a man who'd made his choice and wouldn't be moved. "Miss DeVille is in my custody," Jacob said quietly, "and she's not going anywhere with you. She's awaiting transport to Tucson under official territorial authority, and I don't care what kind of license you're carrying, you're not taking my prisoner." Clay's smile faded, replaced by a hardness that suggested violence was always his preferred solution. "Now, Sheriff," he said, "we don't want trouble, but that woman's worth $2,000, and we've been tracking her for 3 months. We got rights to that bounty. So you can either step aside peaceable-like, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice."
Jacob's mind worked with the clarity that came in moments of extreme danger, calculating odds, assessing positions, knowing that he was outnumbered, but also knowing the layout of his office in ways these men didn't, knowing that Tom would be back soon with reinforcements, knowing that he just needed to buy time, needed to keep Catherine safe long enough to get her out. "The hard way, then," Jacob said, and his hand moved with the speed that had made him legendary in Kansas, the Colt clearing leather with practiced efficiency, and he shot Clay Morrison in the shoulder before any of the brothers could react, the sound of the gunshot impossibly loud in the confined space, and Clay went down screaming, and chaos erupted. The other 2 Morrison brothers drew their guns, and Jacob dove behind his desk as bullets splintered the wood, as the office filled with gun smoke and noise and the primal terror of men trying to kill each other. And Catherine was shouting something from the cell, but Jacob couldn't hear over the roar of gunfire, couldn't focus on anything except survival, except putting down these threats, except protecting the woman behind bars who'd somehow become more important to him than his own life. He fired twice more, heard one of the brothers cry out, saw a body fall, but then something punched him in the side with terrific force, and he looked down to see blood spreading across his shirt, bright red against the tan fabric, and he realized he'd been shot, realized the wound was bad, realized that time was running out in more ways than one. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, Jacob saw Tom Carter burst through the door with his gun drawn, saw the young deputy take in the scene with wide eyes, saw him shoot the last standing Morrison brother with surprisingly good aim, and then Tom was at Jacob's side, pressing a cloth against the wound, his voice high and panicked. "Jesus, Sheriff, you're hit bad. We need to get Doc Preston. Need to stop this bleeding. What the hell happened?" Jacob grabbed Tom's arm with bloody fingers, pulling the young man close, speaking through gritted teeth as pain shot through his entire body like lightning through a summer sky. "Tom, listen to me. Listen carefully, because I don't have much time. You need to take the keys, unlock that cell, give Catherine a horse and supplies, and let her ride out of here. Let her go north toward Flagstaff. Don't ask questions. Just do it. Do it now." Tom stared at him like he'd lost his mind, his young face a mask of confusion and fear, blood from Jacob's wound spreading across both their hands. "Sheriff, that's a prisoner. That's a wanted criminal. I can't just let her go. That's against everything. That's illegal. You're talking crazy because you're hurt. We need to get you help." Jacob's grip tightened with desperate strength, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that cut through Tom's protests like a blade through silk. "Deputy Carter, I'm giving you a direct order. I'm still your sheriff until I die, which might be in the next few minutes, and I'm telling you to release that prisoner. I'll take full responsibility. I'll write it all down if I live long enough. But Tom, please, please do this for me. She doesn't deserve what's waiting for her. She's a good person who made bad choices, and she deserves a chance. Please."
Something in Jacob's voice, in his eyes, in the raw desperation of his plea must have reached Tom, because the young deputy nodded slowly, his expression still uncertain, but his loyalty to Jacob overriding his confusion, and he moved to the cell, fumbling with the keys, while Jacob slumped against the desk, his vision starting to blur at the edges, blood pooling beneath him on the wooden floor. Catherine emerged from the cell and immediately dropped to her knees beside Jacob, her hands joining Tom's in trying to stop the bleeding, her face pale and stricken. And Jacob looked up at her, memorizing every detail, because he knew with the certainty that comes when a man feels his life slipping away, that this might be the last time he saw her, the last time he'd see those green eyes or hear her voice. "Jacob, no, you can't die. Not for me, not like this. This isn't fair. This isn't right," Catherine was saying, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. And Jacob reached up with a shaking hand to touch her cheek, his fingers leaving a smear of blood that looked like war paint in the dim light. "Catherine," he whispered, "you need to go. Need to ride now before more trouble comes. Tom will help you, and I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll live, really live. Not just survive, but thrive. Build something beautiful. Be happy. And maybe, sometimes, think of the sheriff who loved you enough to let you go. Can you do that for me?" Catherine was shaking her head, crying openly now, her composure completely shattered, and she leaned down, pressing her forehead against Jacob, her tears falling on his face like rain. "I'm not leaving you to die alone," she said fiercely. "I'm not running while you bleed out because of me. Jacob Morgan, you stubborn, noble, beautiful fool, you can't ask me to do that. You can't make me live with that guilt. I'd rather hang than leave you like this." Jacob felt something warm bloom in his chest, despite the cold that was spreading through his body, felt a joy so profound it almost eclipsed the pain, because Catherine's words meant she felt it too, felt the impossible connection that had formed between them in just 8 days, felt the love that had grown in the cracks of their broken lives like flowers in desert stone. "Tom," Jacob said, his voice weaker now, "get Doc Preston. Tell him I'm shot. And tell him to hurry. And, Catherine, if you won't leave, then stay. Stay with me. Let me look at you. Let me have this. Let me have you here at the end, if the end is coming." Tom ran from the office, shouting for the doctor, and Jacob was alone with Catherine, just the two of them, and the bodies of the Morrison brothers, and the gun smoke slowly clearing, and Catherine held his hand, stroked his hair, whispered things he couldn't quite hear but which felt like prayers or promises or both, and Jacob let himself drift, let himself imagine a different world where they'd met under different circumstances, where he wasn't a sheriff and she wasn't wanted, where they could have built a life together, ordinary and beautiful and free. Doc Preston arrived within minutes, a gruff man in his 60s who'd seen more bullet wounds than any frontier doctor should have to, and he took one look at Jacob's injury, at the placement and the blood loss, and his expression grew grim but determined. "Get him on the table in the back room," Doc ordered, "and someone boil water, get me clean cloth, and clear out everyone except people who can help. This is going to be touch and go. That bullet's lodged near vital organs, and I'll need to operate immediately if there's any chance of saving him." They moved Jacob to the back room, Catherine refusing to leave his side despite Doc Preston's initial protests, and what followed was hours of agony, of Doc probing for the bullet while Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness, of Catherine holding his hand and talking to him, telling him about Boston, about her childhood, about dreams she'd had before the world had turned hard.
and her voice became an anchor, the only thing keeping Jacob tethered to life when the pain became so overwhelming that letting go seemed like the merciful option. Tom assisted the doctor with a steadiness that surprised everyone, proving himself capable under pressure. And slowly, painstakingly, Doc Preston extracted the bullet, stitched the wound, and wrapped Jacob's torso in tight bandages. And when it was finally done, when Doc stepped back, wiping blood from his hands, he looked at Catherine and Tom with exhausted eyes. "He's alive," Doc said simply, "but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will tell us whether he'll make it. He needs rest, needs to stay still, needs someone watching him constantly, and he needs luck, more luck than most men get. So if any of you are the praying type, now would be the time." Catherine stayed by Jacob's side through that first night and the day that followed and the night after that, sleeping in a chair pulled close to his bed, changing his bandages when Doc Preston showed her how, spooning broth into his mouth during the brief periods when he was conscious enough to swallow, and talking to him constantly, whether he could hear her or not, because she'd decided that if Jacob Morgan had been willing to die for her, the least she could do was fight to keep him alive. Tom handled the aftermath of the shooting, reporting to the territorial marshal that the Morrison brothers had attempted to illegally seize a prisoner and had opened fire on the sheriff, that Jacob had acted in self-defense, and that the matter was closed with 3 bodies buried in the town cemetery and one brother, Clay, recovering from his shoulder wound in the very cell that had held Catherine, facing charges of attempted murder of a lawman. The marshal's response when it came 3 days later via telegram was terse but clear. Sheriff Morgan's actions were justified. The Morrison brothers had operated outside their authority, and the matter was concluded. But there was a pointed question at the end asking about the status of Catherine DeVille and when she would be transported for trial. And Tom, in a moment of loyalty that would define his character for years to come, sent back a message saying that Miss DeVille had escaped during the confusion of the shooting, that she'd overpowered him while he was distracted helping the wounded sheriff, and that she was believed to be heading toward Mexico, description and last known direction attached. Jacob woke on the 4th day, really woke, his eyes focusing on the ceiling of the back room, his mind clearing from the fog of fever and morphine, and the first thing he saw when he turned his head was Catherine, asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still holding his, her face peaceful in sleep, despite the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and worry. He squeezed her hand gently, and her eyes opened immediately, and for a moment they just looked at each other, and Jacob saw in her expression something he'd never seen directed at him before, something that looked like love mixed with relief and fierce protectiveness, and he felt his heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. "You're awake," Catherine said, her voice hoarse from days of talking and crying. "Jacob, you're really awake. Do you know how close we came to losing you? How close I came to losing you?" Jacob tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, and Catherine quickly brought water to his lips, helping him drink, her hand cradling his head with infinite gentleness. "How long?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. 4 days, Catherine replied. 4 days of fighting, of not knowing if you'd open your eyes again. And Jacob, Tom told the marshal I escaped. He lied for you, for us. So I'm officially a fugitive again. But this time I have nowhere to go except right here. Because I realized something while I was sitting here watching you fight to stay alive. I realized that I love you, Jacob Morgan. I love you with everything I have left, and I'm not running anymore. Not from the law, not from my past, and definitely not from you. The words hung in the air between them, impossibly precious, impossibly dangerous, and Jacob felt tears prick his eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming emotion of hearing what he'd hoped for but never expected. Hearing that this woman, this extraordinary, complicated, beautiful woman, loved him back, loved him enough to risk everything. "Catherine," he said, his voice stronger now, "you can't stay. They'll find out eventually. They'll come for you, and I can't protect you if I'm laid up like this. You need to take the chance Tom gave you, need to ride north like I said, need to save yourself while there's still time." Catherine shook her head, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination he'd seen when she'd turned herself in, when she'd refused to abandon him while he was dying. "No," she said firmly. "No more running, Jacob. I spent 3 years running from the law and a year running from myself, and I'm done. I'm staying here with you, and we'll figure out what comes next together, because that's what people do when they love each other. They face things together. They don't abandon each other when things get hard. And if the territorial law wants to hang me, they'll have to do it in front of you and this whole town. And we'll see if they have the stomach for it after everyone here knows what I did to save those people on the stage."
Over the following weeks, as Jacob slowly recovered, as his strength returned and the wound healed into an angry red scar that Doc Preston said would probably pain him for the rest of his life, a strange thing happened in Redemption Creek, something that neither Jacob nor Catherine could have predicted, but which changed everything. The story of what had happened, of the sheriff who'd nearly died protecting a prisoner from illegal bounty hunters, of the wanted woman who'd stayed to nurse him back to health when she could have escaped, of the young deputy who lied to territorial authorities out of loyalty to his sheriff, spread through the town like wildfire. And instead of outrage or demands that Catherine be arrested, the townspeople rallied around them. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from the stage, started a petition asking the territorial governor to grant Catherine a full pardon based on her act of heroism, and within days she had over 200 signatures, nearly everyone in Redemption Creek and several surrounding settlements. The young father whose children Catherine had saved traveled to Tucson personally to testify before the territorial judge about what had happened, bringing his 3 kids to stand in the courtroom and tell how the woman everyone wanted to hang had saved their lives. Pete Collins wrote letters to newspapers throughout the territory describing Catherine's courage and marksmanship, and several editors, always hungry for compelling stories, picked up the tale, and suddenly Catherine DeVille was no longer just a wanted criminal, but a figure of public fascination, a woman whose past crimes were being weighed against her recent heroism in the court of public opinion. Jacob, confined to his bed for the first 2 weeks, and then to light duties around the office for another 2, watched all of this unfold with a mixture of amazement and hope, because he lived long enough to know that public sentiment could move mountains, could pressure politicians and judges, could sometimes achieve what the law alone could not. Catherine helped around the sheriff's office, cooking meals, organizing paperwork, and slowly becoming part of the town's daily fabric, and the people of Redemption Creek, who'd initially been wary of her, began to see what Jacob had seen, a woman of intelligence and courage who'd made terrible mistakes but who was fundamentally decent, fundamentally worth saving. Tom Carter proved himself in those weeks, stepping up as acting sheriff while Jacob recovered, handling disputes and minor crimes with a maturity that surprised everyone, and he and Catherine developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect and their shared love for Jacob, and Tom would later admit that watching Catherine care for Jacob with such devotion had taught him more about love and sacrifice than any sermon he'd ever heard in church. The territorial governor's response to the petition came 6 weeks after the shooting, delivered by courier to Jacob's office on a crisp October morning when the desert air had finally lost its brutal summer heat. And Jacob opened the official envelope with shaking hands while Catherine and Tom watched, holding their breath, hoping for mercy, but preparing for disappointment.
The letter inside was formal, written in the flowery language of territorial bureaucracy, but its substance was clear. Based on the testimony of numerous witnesses, based on Catherine DeVille's act of valor in protecting innocent lives, based on her voluntary surrender to authorities, and based on the recommendation of several prominent citizens, including Judge Harrison from Tucson, who'd been moved by the testimony of the father and his children, the governor was granting Catherine a conditional pardon. Her previous crimes would be forgiven, provided she maintained lawful behavior for a probationary period of 5 years, during which time she would be required to report quarterly to the local sheriff and to commit no further offenses. And at the end of that period, assuming compliance, her record would be expunged, and she would be considered a free citizen with no criminal history. Jacob read the letter aloud, his voice cracking with emotion. And when he finished, Catherine sat down heavily in a chair, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, because she'd expected justice, but had received mercy, had expected punishment, but had received a second chance, had expected an ending, but had received a beginning. "You're free," Jacob said, moving to kneel in front of her, despite the protest from his healing wound, taking her hands in his. "Catherine, you're free. You did it. You faced your past and you won. You're going to have the life you deserve." Catherine pulled him close, holding him tight, and they stayed like that for a long time. Two broken people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd risked everything for love, who'd somehow, impossibly, been granted a future together. The next 5 years were the best of Jacob Morgan's life. Years that rewrote everything he thought he knew about happiness, about partnership, about what it meant to build something worth having. Catherine stayed in Redemption Creek, and 3 months after receiving her pardon, she and Jacob were married in a small ceremony at the town church, with Tom Carter serving as best man and Mrs. Henderson crying happy tears in the front pew. And their wedding was attended by half the town, people who'd come to love Catherine as one of their own, who saw in her story a reflection of the territory itself, wild and violent and beautiful and capable of redemption. Catherine took Jacob's last name, becoming Catherine Morgan, and she threw herself into building a life in Redemption Creek with the same intensity she'd once brought to survival. She started a school for children whose parents couldn't afford formal education, teaching reading and arithmetic in a one-room building that the town helped construct. And she became known as one of the finest educators in the territory, patient with slow learners, challenging for bright ones, and absolutely intolerant of bullying or meanness. Jacob continued as sheriff, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the events of that autumn, because the story of how he'd nearly died protecting a prisoner from illegal bounty hunters had spread far beyond Redemption Creek, and young men seeking careers in law enforcement would sometimes travel to town just to meet him, to ask his advice, to learn from someone who'd proven that integrity and courage still mattered.
Together, Jacob and Catherine became pillars of the community, their home a modest house on the edge of town, becoming a gathering place for town meetings, for Sunday dinners, for anyone who needed advice or help, or just someone to listen. And they built a marriage based on absolute honesty, on shared values, on the understanding that they'd both survived darkness and had chosen light. And in the quiet moments, in the evenings when they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the desert, they'd hold hands and talk about everything and nothing. And Jacob would sometimes shake his head in wonder at how his life had turned out, how the woman he'd arrested had become his wife, his partner, his reason for waking up each morning with gratitude. Catherine kept her promise to Jacob. She lived fully, throwing herself into teaching, into community work, into being the person she'd always wanted to be but had never had the chance to become. And the ghosts of her past, while never fully gone, became manageable, became part of her story rather than the entirety of it. And she made peace with what she'd done by dedicating herself to making the world a little better, one student at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one day at a time. They never had children of their own, though Catherine taught hundreds of children over the years and loved them all fiercely. And Jacob would sometimes joke that his wife had so many kids that he'd never be able to keep track of them all. And they'd laugh together, content with the family they'd built from the community around them. Tom Carter became sheriff when Jacob retired at age 45, his wound having left him with chronic pain that made the physical demands of the job increasingly difficult. And Jacob recommended Tom for the position with absolute confidence, knowing that the young deputy had grown into a fine lawman,
principled but compassionate, tough but fair. And Tom would go on to serve Redemption Creek for another 20 years, always crediting Jacob and Catherine with teaching him what real justice looked like, teaching him that the law was supposed to serve humanity, not the other way around. The 5-year probationary period passed without incident, and on the day Catherine received her official notice of expungement, Jacob took her to the finest restaurant in Tucson, a 100-mile journey that took 2 days by stage, and they celebrated with champagne and steak and dancing, and Jacob held his wife close and whispered that he'd never doubted her, never regretted his choice, never stopped thanking whatever force had brought her into his life. And Catherine whispered back that she loved him more than words could express, that he'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, and that she'd spend the rest of her life proving herself worthy of his faith. They grew old together in Redemption Creek, watching the town evolve, from a rough frontier settlement to a proper community with paved streets, a telegraph office that actually worked reliably, a hotel with real beds and no bedbugs, and eventually, in 1901, electricity. And through it all, they remained devoted to each other and to the town they'd helped build. Jacob Morgan died in 1907 at the age of 59, the old bullet wound having finally taken its toll on his body, causing complications that the doctors said were inevitable. And he died at home with Catherine holding his hand, surrounded by friends and former students and townspeople who'd come to say goodbye to a man who'd defined justice for an entire generation. And his last words were to Catherine, telling her that loving her had been the best decision of his life, that he'd do it all again in a heartbeat, that she should live on and be happy and never forget that she'd been his salvation as much as he'd been hers. Catherine lived another 15 years after Jacob's death, continuing to teach until she was too frail to stand in front of a classroom, and she never remarried, never even considered it, because she'd had her great love and nothing else could compare. And she'd tell anyone who asked that she'd been blessed beyond measure, that the years with Jacob had been worth every moment of hardship that had come before, that their story proved redemption was possible, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that people could change, could choose to be better, could build something beautiful from the ashes of their mistakes. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1922 at the age of 77, and the town of Redemption Creek shut down for her funeral, hundreds of people attending, including former students who traveled from all over the territory to pay their respects. And she was buried next to Jacob in the town cemetery, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, and a single inscription that Catherine had requested years earlier: two souls who found each other in darkness and walked into light together. Now, if this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and redemption and the complicated nature of love and choice, I need you to do something for me. I need you to hit that like button right now. I need you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we're bringing you stories from the Wild West that dig deep into the moral complexity of frontier life, stories that show you the real human beings behind the legends, the choices they made, and the prices they paid. And I need you to drop a comment below telling me what you thought about Jacob's decision. Would you have let Catherine go? Would you have risked everything for someone you'd known for only 8 days? Or do you think he betrayed his oath, betrayed the law he'd sworn to uphold? And was the ending, with both of them finding happiness and redemption, was that justice, or was it just a convenient fairy tale? I want to hear your thoughts. I want to know where you stand on this, because these moral questions, these impossible choices, they're what make Wild West history so fascinating, so relevant even today. And before you go, let me tell you something important. This story, as incredible as it sounds, is based on real events, based on documented accounts from Redemption Creek, Arizona, from newspaper articles and court records and letters that survived in the town's historical society. The names have been changed and some details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. But the core of it, the sheriff who fell in love with a wanted criminal, who nearly died protecting her, who built a life with her that lasted decades, that's all real. That all happened. And that's what makes it so powerful, because it proves that even in the violent, lawless territories of the American frontier, even in a world where justice was often delivered at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun, there was still room for mercy, for second chances, for love that defied logic and convention, and the simple categories we use to divide people into good and bad.
Think about Jacob Morgan for a moment. Think about what it cost him to make the choice he made. He was willing to die, literally took a bullet and nearly bled out on the floor of his own office, all to protect a woman who, by every legal standard, he should have handed over to the bounty hunters, a woman whose crimes were documented, whose guilt was not in question. And yet he looked past the charges and the wanted posters and saw the person beneath, saw Catherine DeVille's intelligence and courage and desperate desire to be better than her past. And he made a choice that the law would never have made, that logic couldn't justify, that only love could explain. And that's the power of this story. That's what makes it resonate more than 100 years later. Because we all face moments in our lives where we have to choose between what's legal and what's right, between following rules and following our hearts, between the easy path and the path that requires everything we have. Jacob Morgan chose love over law, chose mercy over justice, chose the complicated reality of a human being over the simple classification of a criminal. And in doing so, he saved not just Catherine's life, but his own soul. Because what kind of man would he have been if he'd handed her over, if he'd watched her hang, knowing what he knew about her, knowing that she'd saved innocent lives, knowing that she was trying so hard to change? He would have been technically correct, legally justified, but morally bankrupt. And he knew it, which is why he made the choice he made. Why he gave her the keys and told her to run, why he was willing to sacrifice his badge, his reputation, his entire life for her freedom. And Catherine. Think about Catherine DeVille. Think about what it took for her to turn herself in, to walk into that town knowing she'd be arrested, knowing she might hang, but doing it anyway because she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of living as someone she no longer wanted to be. That takes a kind of courage that most people never have to muster. The courage to face consequences, to accept responsibility, to say, I did terrible things and I'm ready to answer for them. And the fact that she got a second chance, that the governor pardoned her based on her heroism and her obvious rehabilitation, that's not a failure of justice. That's justice working exactly as it should. Because justice isn't supposed to be about revenge. It's supposed to be about making society safer, about rehabilitation when possible, about recognizing that human beings are capable of change. And Catherine proved she'd changed, proved it by saving lives when she could have kept running, proved it by staying with Jacob when she could have escaped during the chaos of the shooting, proved it by building a life of service and education that benefited hundreds of people. And the territory recognized that. The governor recognized that. The people of Redemption Creek recognized that. And they chose mercy, chose to give her the chance she'd earned through her actions and her clear commitment to being better. And she repaid that mercy with 30 years of dedicated teaching, 30 years of making her community stronger,
30 years of proving every single day that redemption is real, that people can change, that second chances are worth giving.
Their love story is unconventional, sure. It breaks every rule about how these things are supposed to work. How a lawman and a criminal aren't supposed to fall for each other, aren't supposed to build a life together. But love doesn't care about conventions, doesn't care about what's supposed to happen. It just happens. And when it's real, when it's the kind of love that makes you willing to die for someone, willing to sacrifice everything you've worked for, willing to face judgment and criticism and the possibility of losing everything, then it's worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth building a life around. And that's what Jacob and Catherine did. They fought for their love. They protected it against a world that thought they were crazy. They built a marriage that lasted 30 years until death separated them. And by all accounts, by the testimony of people who knew them, they were happy, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that comes from knowing you found your person, your partner, your home in another human being. The people of Redemption Creek, they saw it too. Saw how Jacob and Catherine complemented each other, how they made each other better, how their love created ripples that improved the entire community. And that's why they rallied around Catherine, why they signed petitions and wrote letters and testified on her behalf. Because they recognized that sometimes the rules need to bend, that sometimes justice requires mercy, that sometimes the best thing for everyone is to let the past stay in the past and focus on building a better future. This story challenges us to think about our own capacity for forgiveness, for seeing beyond labels and categories, for recognizing the humanity in people who've made terrible mistakes. Because we live in a world that loves to divide people into good guys and bad guys, into criminals and law-abiding citizens, into those worthy of redemption and those beyond saving. But the reality is infinitely more complicated. Everyone's got a story, everyone's got context, everyone's got circumstances that shape them and choices they regret. And if we're going to build a society worth living in, we need to create space for second chances, for rehabilitation, for the recognition that people can grow and change and become better than they were. And Catherine DeVille's story, Jacob Morgan's story, their story together, it's proof that this isn't just idealistic nonsense. It's possible. It happens. It can work when people are willing to see past the surface, past the wanted posters and criminal records, to the human being underneath. Now, I'm not saying everyone deserves infinite chances. I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences for harmful actions. But I am saying that we should evaluate each case on its own merits, should look at whether someone is genuinely trying to change, whether they're taking responsibility, whether they're contributing positively to society. And if the answer is yes, then maybe, just maybe, we should be willing to extend mercy, to offer that second chance, to believe in redemption. Because the alternative is a world where one mistake defines you forever, where there's no path back from the wrong turn, where people who want to be better have nowhere to go except back to the life they're trying to escape. And that's not justice. That's just cruelty disguised as righteousness. Jacob and Catherine's story also reminds us that love can be a transformative force, can change not just individuals, but entire communities. Because their relationship, unlikely as it was, impossible as it seemed, became a model for others, became proof that compassion and understanding could achieve what punishment alone never could. And the town of Redemption Creek, which had been just another rough frontier settlement, became something more under their influence, became a place known for giving people second chances, for judging individuals by their actions rather than their past, for creating space for redemption and growth. And that legacy lasted long after both Jacob and Catherine were gone, lasted into the 20th century and beyond, influenced generations of people who heard their story and learned from it. Think about the ripple effects.
Think about the hundreds of students Catherine taught, many of them children of poor families, drifters, former criminals, people on the margins who might never have gotten an education otherwise, and how those students went on to have their own lives, their own careers, their own families, and how they probably told their children about Mrs. Morgan, the teacher who believed in them, who saw potential in everyone, who never gave up on a student, no matter how difficult, and how that attitude, that belief in human potential, in second chances, in redemption, spread through generations like seeds on the wind, growing into something beautiful and lasting. And Tom Carter, young Deputy Tom who lied to the territorial marshal, who risked his own career to protect Catherine, who learned from Jacob and Catherine what real justice looked like. He went on to be sheriff for 20 years, and he brought that same philosophy to his work, that same balance of toughness and compassion, that same willingness to see people as individuals rather than as labels. And how many lives did he change? How many people got second chances because Tom Carter had learned from Jacob Morgan that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same, and that when they diverge, you have to have the courage to follow your conscience, to do what's right, even when it costs you. These cascading effects, these ripples of influence spreading outward from one decision, from one moment when Jacob chose love over law, that's the real story here. That's the thing that matters more than any individual happy ending, because it shows that our choices matter, that the decisions we make in moments of crisis can shape not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others, can create patterns of behavior that last for generations, can build communities that are more compassionate, more understanding, more willing to believe in human potential. Now, I want you to think about your own life for a moment. Think about the times when you've had to choose between following rules and following your heart, between doing what's expected and doing what feels right, between judging someone by their worst moment and seeing them as a whole person with context and complexity. We all face these choices, maybe not as dramatically as Jacob Morgan faced them, maybe not with life and death stakes, but they're there, in the small interactions, in the daily decisions we make about how to treat people, how to respond to mistakes, whether to extend forgiveness or hold grudges, whether to believe in someone's capacity to change or write them off as beyond help. And the truth is, most of us don't have Jacob's courage. Most of us play it safe, follow the rules, do what's expected, because it's easier, because it protects us from criticism, because taking a stand for someone, believing in someone, fighting for someone when the world says you're wrong, that's hard, that's scary. That requires a kind of strength that doesn't come naturally. But maybe, just maybe, hearing this story will inspire you to be a little braver, to take a chance on someone, to extend mercy when you could justifiably choose judgment, to see the person behind the mistake, because that's how change happens. That's how we build a better world, one choice at a time, one act of compassion at a time, one person willing to say, I see you, I believe you can be better, and I'm going to help you get there. And if you do that, if you take that risk, you might be surprised at what happens. You might find that people rise to meet expectations, that second chances often work out better than anyone expects, that love and trust and belief in human potential can create miracles.
So here's what I want you to do. Hit that like button if this story affected you, if it made you think, if it challenged your assumptions about justice and redemption and what people deserve. Subscribe to Wild West Revenge because we're going to keep bringing you these stories, these complicated, morally challenging, deeply human stories from the frontier that show you a side of history you never learned in school. And most importantly,
Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between rules and compassion. Tell me whether you think Jacob made the right choice, whether Catherine deserved her pardon, whether their story gives you hope or makes you uncomfortable. I want to hear it all. I want to start a conversation because these questions matter. They mattered in 1873 and they matter today. And by talking about them, by wrestling with them, by challenging ourselves to think more deeply about justice and mercy and the complicated reality of human nature, we make ourselves better. We make our communities better. We make the world a little bit more like Redemption Creek at its best. A place where people get second chances, where love can overcome obstacles, where redemption is always possible for those willing to do the work. And let me leave you with this final thought. Jacob Morgan and Catherine DeVille, sheriff and outlaw, lawman and criminal, they should have been enemies. Everything about their circumstances said they should have been on opposite sides. And yet they found love, found partnership, found a way to build something beautiful from the most unlikely materials. And they did it not by ignoring the past or pretending it didn't exist, but by acknowledging it, taking responsibility for it, and choosing to move forward together, choosing to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, that people could change, that love could heal, that redemption was worth fighting for. And they were right. They were proven right by 30 years of marriage, by hundreds of students educated, by a community transformed, by a legacy that outlasted them both and continues to inspire people more than a century later. That's the power of choosing love, of choosing mercy, of choosing to see the best in people even when the world tells you to see the worst. And if that doesn't inspire you, if that doesn't make you want to be better, to do better, to take chances on people and believe in second chances and fight for love even when it's hard, then I don't know what will. Because this is what Wild West Revenge is all about. Finding these stories that challenge us, that make us uncomfortable, that force us to confront our own beliefs about justice and mercy and what people deserve, and bringing them to you in a way that honors the real people who lived these lives, who made these impossible choices, who paid the prices and reaped the rewards and left behind legacies that still echo through time. The historical records from Redemption Creek tell us some additional details that are worth sharing. Details that fill out the picture of Jacob and Catherine's life together and show us the day-to-day reality of their extraordinary partnership. Because it wasn't all romance and drama, there were ordinary moments too. Moments that, in some ways, are even more powerful than the dramatic rescue and the near-death experience and the governor's pardon, because they show us two people actually building a life, actually doing the hard work of marriage and community and making good on the second chance they'd been given. Town records show that Jacob and Catherine owned a small ranch on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, about 20 acres where they kept horses and a few cattle, not enough to make them wealthy, but enough to supplement Jacob's sheriff's salary and later his modest pension. And Catherine apparently had a real gift with horses, could break and train them with a gentleness that produced animals known throughout the territory for their calm temperament and reliability. Several letters survive in the historical archives, letters from Catherine to friends back east, and in them she writes about her life with Jacob with a mixture of gratitude and wonder, talking about how strange it is to wake up each morning without fear, without looking over her shoulder, without wondering if today will be the day her past catches up with her. And how Jacob's steady presence, his unwavering faith in her, gave her the foundation she needed to rebuild herself into someone she could be proud of. One letter in particular, dated December 1878, 5 years after they met, right around the time Catherine's probation ended and her record was expunged, is especially moving. She writes about watching Jacob teach a young boy to shoot, a kid from one of the poor families in town whose father had died in a mining accident, and how patient Jacob was, how he took the time to explain not just the mechanics of aiming and firing, but the responsibility that came with carrying a weapon, the moral weight of having the power to take life. And Catherine writes that watching him teach that boy made her love him even more because it reminded her of how he'd treated her from the very beginning, with respect and dignity, even when she was behind bars, with an assumption that she was capable of being better than her worst actions. And she writes that she tries every day to live up to the faith he showed in her, tries to be worthy of the sacrifice he made, and that sometimes she still can't believe how lucky she is, how she went from being a wanted criminal with a noose waiting for her to being a respectable married woman with a home and a purpose and a man who loves her unconditionally. Reading letters like that, you get a sense of the psychological weight Catherine must have carried, the constant awareness that her happiness was built on the rubble of a violent past, the guilt that probably never fully left her despite the pardon and the good work she did, because killing people, even in self-defense or in the chaos of criminal life, that stays with you, leaves scars that don't show but that never quite heal. And the fact that she channeled that guilt into positive action, into teaching and service and building rather than destroying, that's another kind of courage. The courage to live with yourself when you know what you're capable of, when you've seen the darkness inside yourself and chosen to walk toward light anyway.
Jacob's journal entries, several dozen pages of which were donated to the Arizona Historical Society in the 1960s by a descendant of Tom Carter, reveal a similar internal landscape, a man wrestling with the contradiction between his role as a lawman and his choice to protect Catherine. And in one entry from November 1873, just weeks after the shooting, while he was still recovering, Jacob writes about lying awake at night, wondering if he'd betrayed everything he stood for, wondering if he'd put his personal feelings above his duty to uphold the law, wondering if he was a hypocrite for wearing a badge while harboring a criminal. And then he writes about looking over at Catherine, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, her face peaceful despite the exhaustion etched into every line, her hand still holding his even in sleep. And he writes that in that moment he realized he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow, that the law was supposed to serve justice, but that sometimes the two diverged, and that when they did, a man had to follow his heart, because rules without compassion weren't justice. They were just tyranny in a different form. And he writes that he'd rather be a man who loved deeply and acted with integrity, even if it cost him his badge, than a man who hid behind rules to avoid the hard work of moral decision-making. These journal entries humanize Jacob in a way that the legend doesn't. They show us his doubts and fears, his internal struggles, his very human need to justify his actions to himself. And they make his choice even more powerful, because we see that it wasn't easy, wasn't obvious, wasn't something he did lightly or without full awareness of the implications. He knew what he was risking, knew what he was sacrificing, and he did it anyway, because his love for Catherine and his belief in her redemption outweighed everything else. The relationship between Jacob and Catherine also influenced how Redemption Creek handled justice in the years that followed, creating a kind of informal precedent for how the town dealt with people who'd made mistakes. Town council minutes from the 1880s and 1890s show multiple instances where someone with a criminal past was given work, given a chance to prove themselves, given the benefit of doubt in ways that were unusual for frontier communities. And several times the minutes explicitly reference the Morgan case, using Jacob and Catherine's story as justification for extending mercy, for believing in rehabilitation, for choosing community integration over punishment. And while not every case worked out, while some people took advantage of the town's generosity and caused trouble, enough of them succeeded, enough of them turned their lives around and became productive members of society, that Redemption Creek developed a reputation as a place where people could start over,
where past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. And that reputation attracted a particular kind of settler, people who were running from something, or trying to escape a past, or looking for a second chance. And many of them found it in Redemption Creek, found a community willing to give them the chance they needed. And that diversity of experience, that willingness to accept people with complicated histories, made the town stronger, more resilient, more interesting than settlements that demanded conformity and perfection from their residents.
Catherine's school became legendary throughout the territory, and by the 1890s it had grown from a one-room building to a proper schoolhouse with 3 teachers working under Catherine's direction, teaching not just basic literacy and arithmetic, but also practical skills like bookkeeping and surveying, and history and literature and science, providing an education that rivaled what students could get in much larger towns. And the school was free, funded by town donations and by Catherine's tireless fundraising efforts, meaning that even the poorest families could send their children, could give them opportunities that hadn't existed a generation earlier. And many of those students went on to remarkable things. There was a girl named Sarah Chen, daughter of a Chinese immigrant who'd worked on the railroad, who became one of the first Asian American lawyers in Arizona. And she always credited Catherine with teaching her to read and encouraging her to pursue education when everyone else told her that girls, especially Chinese girls, didn't need schooling. There was a boy named Marcus Freeman, son of formerly enslaved people who'd migrated west after the Civil War, who became a prominent businessman in Tucson and later a state senator. And he wrote in his autobiography about how Mrs. Morgan had seen potential in him that his own parents had been too beaten down by life to recognize, had pushed him to think bigger, to believe he could be more than just a laborer or servant, had given him books and challenged him and believed in him when belief was the rarest commodity in his life. Stories like these multiply across decades. Hundreds of students whose lives were changed by Catherine's teaching, by her refusal to accept that anyone was beyond help or unworthy of education, by her belief that knowledge and opportunity could break cycles of poverty and crime and despair. And each one of those students carried forward the lesson she'd learned from Jacob, that people deserve second chances, that redemption is possible, that love and belief and hard work can overcome almost anything. The love story at the heart of all this, the relationship between Jacob and Catherine, it wasn't just about them, it was about what their love made possible, about how it transformed a community, about how it created ripples that spread outward in ways they could never have anticipated. And that's the thing about real love, the kind that's based on mutual respect and shared values and genuine commitment to each other's growth. It doesn't just make the 2 people involved better, it makes everyone around them better. It creates a standard, sets an example, shows what's possible when people choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over self-protection, courage over fear. And Jacob and Catherine's relationship did all of that for Redemption Creek. It showed to townspeople what it looked like to believe in someone against all evidence, what it looked like to fight for love even when the world said you were crazy, what it looked like to build something beautiful from broken pieces. And people responded to that example, were inspired by it, tried to emulate it in their own relationships and their own dealings with others. And that's how culture changes, how communities evolve, not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual examples of courage and compassion that others witness and try to replicate. When Catherine died in 1922, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, some who'd known her personally, many who knew her only by reputation, who'd heard stories about the outlaw who became a teacher, about the criminal who'd earned a governor's pardon through heroism and service, about the woman who'd loved and been loved by one of the territory's most respected lawmen. And the testimonials at her funeral
recorded by several newspapers, paint a picture of someone who'd become almost mythological in her own lifetime. Someone whose life story had taken on the quality of parable or legend, teaching lessons about redemption and second chances that continue to resonate decades after the events themselves. But it's important to remember that Catherine was a real person, not a saint or a symbol, but a complicated human being who struggled and doubted and sometimes failed, who had bad days and made mistakes even after her reformation, who carried guilt and trauma that sometimes manifested in nightmares or sudden fears or moments of darkness that Jacob had to help her through. And the historical record hints at this complexity, mentions times when Catherine would disappear into herself for days, would stop eating, would refuse to see anyone, including Jacob, battling demons that 1870s society didn't have language for, but that we'd now recognize as PTSD or depression or the after effects of trauma. And each time, Jacob would wait patiently, would be there when she emerged, would hold her and remind her that she was safe, that she was loved, that her past didn't define her present. And slowly, she'd come back, would re-engage with life, and together they'd continue forward, because that's what partnership means. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people helping each other through the hard times, believing in each other when self-belief fails, providing the strength the other person needs until they can find their own strength again. This realistic portrayal, this acknowledgement of struggle and imperfection, makes their story even more powerful, because it shows that redemption isn't a one-time event, isn't a moment of transformation after which everything is easy. It's a daily practice, a constant choice, a struggle that requires support and love and community. And the fact that Catherine had that support, that she had Jacob and later Tom and the people of Redemption Creek believing in her and holding her accountable and giving her reasons to keep choosing the light over the darkness, that's what made her redemption possible. That's what allowed her to build a life worth living. And it's a reminder that none of us can do it alone. That we all need people who believe in us, who see our potential even when we can't see it ourselves, who refuse to let us give up even when giving up seems like the only option.
So Jacob and Catherine's story isn't just a romantic tale, it's also a story about community building, about how societies can create structures that support redemption, about what it takes to balance justice with mercy, about the role that individual courage plays in changing systemic patterns. And those lessons are just as relevant today as they were in 1873 because we still struggle with these questions, still debate how to handle people who've committed crimes, still argue about whether rehabilitation is possible or whether punishment is the only answer, still try to figure out how to balance individual rights with community safety. And we could learn a lot from Redemption Creek, from the example Jacob and Catherine set, from the community that rallied around them and created systems that allowed for redemption while still maintaining order, from the understanding that people are complicated, that circumstances matter, that past behavior doesn't always predict future behavior, that change is possible when people are given the support and opportunity they need to change. Think about our current criminal justice system. Think about how it categorizes people who've made mistakes, how it makes it nearly impossible for formerly incarcerated individuals to find work or housing or reintegrate into society, how it creates barriers that almost force people back into criminal behavior because legitimate opportunities are closed off. And then think about Catherine DeVille, who killed people, who rode with outlaws, who had a $2,000 bounty on her head, and who was given a conditional pardon, was given work, was given a place in the community, was allowed to contribute her skills and energy and intelligence to making society better, and how that investment in her redemption paid dividends for decades, educated hundreds of children, influenced community standards, created positive ripples that spread through generations, and ask yourself, which approach makes more sense? Which approach is more likely to create the kind of society you want to live in?
One that throws away people who've made mistakes, or one that helps them become better? Jacob Morgan's role in all this can't be overstated, because he was the catalyst. He was the one who saw past the wanted poster to the person beneath, who made the choice that set everything else in motion, who risked everything, including his life, to protect someone who society said didn't deserve protection. And his courage, his willingness to stand against convention and law and expectation gave Catherine the chance she needed and gave Redemption Creek an example to follow. And that's the thing about moral courage, about standing up for what you believe even when it costs you. It creates space for others to do the same. It shows that it's possible. It breaks the spell of conformity and fear that keeps most people from taking stands or fighting for unpopular causes. And once that spell is broken, once people see that you can challenge unjust systems and survive, can choose love over law and build something beautiful, they start asking themselves what they're willing to fight for, what principles they're willing to risk comfort and safety to defend, and that's how movements start, how societies change, one person at a time deciding to be brave, to choose integrity over convenience, to act on their values even when it's hard. Jacob didn't set out to be a revolutionary, didn't intend to challenge the territorial justice system or create a model for community-based rehabilitation. He just fell in love with a woman who happened to be a wanted criminal, and he made a choice based on that love. And everything else flowed from that choice, from that single moment of courage and compassion. And that's the beautiful thing about individual moral action. You don't have to have a grand plan or a political agenda or a comprehensive theory of justice. You just have to see another human being clearly, see their potential and their struggle and their desperate desire to be better. And you have to decide to help them, to believe in them, to fight for them. And if you do that, if enough people do that, society changes. Culture evolves, systems adapt. Because at the end of the day, systems are just collections of individual choices, patterns that emerge from millions of daily decisions about how to treat each other. And when those daily decisions shift toward mercy and compassion and belief in human potential, the whole system shifts.
Now, I need to address something that some of you might be thinking, might be objecting to in your minds as you listen to this story. Because not everyone agrees that Catherine deserved her pardon. Not everyone thinks Jacob made the right choice. And those objections are worth taking seriously because they come from legitimate concerns about justice and accountability and the need to maintain social order. So let's talk about it directly. Let's engage with the arguments against what Jacob and Catherine did, because honest engagement with opposing viewpoints is how we sharpen our own thinking and avoid the trap of simplistic narratives that ignore complexity. The strongest argument against Jacob's choice is that he violated his oath, that as a sheriff he swore to uphold the law regardless of personal feelings, and by protecting Catherine, he betrayed that oath, betrayed the community that had trusted him to enforce justice impartially. And there's truth to this criticism. Jacob did violate his oath, did choose personal loyalty over legal duty. And in a society governed by law, that's problematic. Because if every lawman gets to decide which laws to enforce based on personal feelings, you don't have a justice system. You have chaos. You have favoritism and corruption, and the strong preying on the weak without consequence. This is a real concern, not something to be dismissed, and Jacob himself wrestled with it, as his journal entries make clear, because he understood that his choice had implications beyond his personal situation, understood that he was setting a precedent that could be abused by others with less noble intentions. And he didn't have a perfect answer to this critique, didn't have a way to square his actions with his oath in a neat logical framework. All he had was the conviction that, in this specific case, with this specific person, enforcing the letter of the law
would have been a greater injustice than bending it. And he was willing to accept the consequences of that conviction, was willing to lose his badge if necessary, was willing to be judged by his community and by history for the choice he made. The other major argument against Catherine's pardon is that she was, by any objective standard, guilty of serious crimes, including murder, and that pardoning her sent a message that violence can be forgiven if you're sympathetic enough, if your story is compelling enough, if you can generate public support. And this, too, is a legitimate concern, because justice shouldn't be based on popularity contests, shouldn't depend on whether someone's story generates sympathy or whether they have advocates with political influence. It should be blind, should treat everyone equally regardless of background or circumstances. And by that standard, Catherine DeVille got special treatment, got mercy that thousands of other criminals in the same era didn't receive, many of whom probably had equally tragic backstories and equally compelling reasons for their crimes. And it's fair to ask why Catherine deserved a second chance when so many others didn't, why her heroism in saving the stage passengers should outweigh her previous murders, why public sympathy should override legal judgment. And these are difficult questions without easy answers. Questions that get at fundamental tensions in how we think about justice and desert and what people are owed by society. But here's the thing. Here's the response to these valid critiques. Justice in practice has always involved discretion, has always required human judgment about context and circumstances and whether punishment serves any useful purpose. And while perfect consistency is a noble goal, it's not actually possible because every case is unique, every person is unique, every situation involves factors that can't be captured in general rules. And what Jacob did, what the governor did in granting Catherine a pardon, was exercise the discretion that's built into the justice system, was make a judgment call that in this specific case, with this specific person, mercy served justice better than punishment would have. And you can disagree with that judgment, can argue that they got it wrong, but you can't say they violated the principles of justice by exercising discretion, because discretion is part of justice, is how justice adapts to the infinite variety of human situations rather than grinding everyone through the same mechanical process regardless of individual circumstances.
The fact that Catherine actively demonstrated rehabilitation, that she turned herself in, that she saved innocent lives, that she showed genuine remorse and commitment to change, these factors matter. They distinguish her case from situations where someone is simply caught and wants to avoid punishment. And while it's true that not everyone gets the opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation before facing consequences, that doesn't mean we should refuse mercy to those who do get that opportunity, should refuse to acknowledge when someone has clearly changed. And the 5-year probationary period was the community's way of testing whether Catherine's rehabilitation was genuine, of giving her a chance to prove herself while still maintaining oversight and accountability. And she passed that test, spent 5 years living lawfully, contributing positively, proving every day that the mercy she'd been shown wasn't wasted. And at some point, if someone consistently demonstrates that they've changed, that they're no longer a threat, that they're contributing positively to society, continuing to punish them serves no purpose except vengeance. And vengeance isn't justice. It's just socially sanctioned cruelty dressed up in legal language. So yes, Jacob violated his oath. Yes, Catherine got special treatment. Yes, there are legitimate questions about fairness and precedent and the rule of law.
But there are also legitimate arguments that what happened in Redemption Creek represented justice working as it should, adapting to circumstances, recognizing rehabilitation, extending mercy when mercy was earned, and balancing the need for accountability with the recognition that people can change. And reasonable people can disagree about which set of concerns should take precedence, can argue about where to draw lines and how much discretion is too much. But what we can't do is pretend there are easy answers. Can't pretend that rigid application of rules, regardless of circumstances, represents some pure form of justice, while any deviation is corruption or weakness. Because the reality is messier, more complicated, more human than that.